Welcome back to our continuing study of the life of Christ. Hello, I'm Jonathan Bennett, Associate Minister with the Central Church of Christ, meeting at 90 Waverly Court, Martinsburg, West Virginia. You're encouraged to visit the congregation's website, ccocwv.org, to learn more about the congregation meeting in Martinsburg. In this session, we're going to be looking at lesson number 55 in our study of the life of Christ. The title for this lesson is Healing of the Demon-Possessed Boy and Lack of Faith. The scriptural references for this lesson is going to be Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 through 21, Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29, and Luke chapter 9, verses 37 to 43. If you're following along in the Life of Christ commentaries, it's going to come from pages 545 to 561 in volume 1 of that commentary. We're grateful that the series of lessons was produced by the publisher that produces the Truth for Today commentaries, which has produced this Life of Christ study. It was produced back in 2022. Gracious enough to allow congregations to use it, and gracious enough to allow us to use it here at Martinsburg as the format of live streaming it for the live adult Bible classes on Wednesday evenings for a period of 1 year, and also be able to fill in the blanks with the lessons that were not covered in person. So as we take a look at lesson 55, in our last lesson we discussed an amazing moment in the life of Christ, being on the Mount of Transfiguration. Today we're going to discuss the events happened right after this moment when Jesus, Peter, James, and John descended from the mountain. If someone asked you to tell them about your faith, how would you answer? How would you answer that? Would it be a reply similar to what Paul gives over in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, where he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." The Bible has so much to say about faith. For example, Hebrews chapter 11 and the first part of verse 6, the Hebrew writer writes there, "Without faith it is impossible to please God." Or over in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8, we read there that by grace we are saved through faith. Or in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, Paul reminds us that we walk the Christian pathway and we walk by faith and not by sight. Or we can take a look at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 16, where we read about faith as the shield that protects us from the devil. And John, over in 1 John chapter 5, verse 4, the second part of that verse, we read there that faith is the victory that has overcome the world. And there's a song in the songbook, "Faith is the Victory." And it's based off of that concept of what's covered in 1 John chapter 5, verse 4. But we have to remember that the ultimate outcome of faith will be the salvation of our souls. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 9. So when we talk about all this, we ask the question, is your faith strong? And where is your faith strong and where it needs to be all the time? Of course not. We're all human. We all struggle at times in our lives. We're going to be reading of a time when apparently the apostles' faith was struggling in this lesson. We're going to see that Jesus just come down from the mountain. Think about this, the Mount of Transfiguration, only to find the people who he had been training nonstop were still lacking in a very important point of their faith. Now we turn back to Mark chapter 9. I encourage you, if you have your Bible with you, to turn there. Mark chapter 9. And we're going to be reading the beginning of the 14th verse and reading down to verse 29, and we'll come back and discuss what we've read in the scriptural text. So in Mark chapter 9, beginning in the 14th verse, Mark records this. When he, that is Jesus, came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and scribes disputing with them. Immediately, when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him, greeted him. He asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" Then one of the crowd answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who has a mute spirit. And wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not." And Jesus answered him and said, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." They brought him to him. When he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" The father said, "From childhood, and often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more." Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him. And he became as one dead, so that many said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, that is Jesus' disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" Jesus said to them, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." So let's back up here and go back to the beginning of this passage we just read from the book of Mark, beginning in verse 14. In verses 14 and 15, we see a very familiar setting. A very familiar setting. We see that there is a great crowd made up of scribes who were arguing with Jesus' disciples. Now think about this. How often has this been going on? There's always turmoil between the scribes with the scribes and Pharisees and Jesus and his disciples. The scribes and Pharisees help make up the Sanhedrin. There's always tension. There's always some type of dispute. And the crowd saw Jesus. While the scribes are arguing with Jesus' disciples, the crowd sees Jesus and they come running to him. We see this here. They come running to him and they greet him. But not only, and when this happens, what happens here? We see that Jesus asks them, he asks the scribes, "What are you discussing with him?" He's asking them, "What are you discussing with my disciples?" But we see here, and that was verse 16. And then we see down, moving to verse 17, we see this of the feeble boy. We see this of the feeble boy coming in here. And we see that that this man had brought his son to Jesus, and Jesus' disciples were not able to cast the demon out of him. And the demon's causing him a lot of pain, a lot of anguish. Now, we think about this, and we think about the causing the boy a lot of pain. He's causing him to have what we would describe as a grand mal seizure, a seizure that would shut him completely down, causes the body to be very rigid, foaming at the mouth, thrashing around. And we see here that's what it describes. It says, if we look at it, essentially, we're told he was not able to hear or speak. The demon would throw him to the ground where he would lie writhing, grinding his teeth, foaming his mouth. Again, very vivid description of what a seizure would look like. What we would say was a seizure. But what else does this demon do to this young man? It causes him to fall into the water or fall into the fire. Now we have to think about this. This isn't one of those things where they had to go out and find fire during this. And we think back to the first century. Many times they would have their home built where they would have like a fire built where like in a fireplace or in a central point in the home that was used for warmth and also for cooking purposes. And this spirit would have been trying to throw him into it, not to destroy him, but to torment him. Because think about this: he didn't want it to. Even though the father said the demon's purpose was to destroy his son, demons required a living host to dwell in. So we see this. So it was tormenting him, causing him great torment. It was tormenting this demon was tormenting its host by throwing this young man into the fire. Or at this point in history, there may have been bridges around, but there was a lot of times that they would just wade across creeks or streams or river. Well, this demon's casting him down in the water, causing him to thrash around and potentially begin to aspirate water, and it caused what we would describe as symptoms of drowning, though he never killed him. So this young man is brought to Jesus for him to heal, and the father made it clear that Jesus' disciples could not cast out the demon. Mark chapter 9, verse 18. So we see that. Now we move down here, and when they tell him this, we see Jesus become a frustrated teacher. Jesus would become, we're reminded that Jesus here is still God the Son, but he's God the Son in the human form. We can only imagine that the human side of Jesus here, we can't help but imagine what his voice, hear the longing to go be back with the Father in heaven. When he says, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you?" Then he says, "Bring him to me." We can not only hear the longing in his voice to be back with the Father in heaven, but we can also, if we imagine this, can hear the concern in his voice about the preparation of his disciples. He'd been spending time with them. "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you?" Meaning, he's essentially saying, how long have I been with you, and how much longer do I need to be with you to get you to realize the magnitude of the things that I'm teaching you and I'm showing you and guiding you in. But in that he says, "Bring him to me." And Jesus, he comes down here in verse 20. He says that when they brought the young man to him, and then Jesus sees this young man drop to the ground and begin convulsing and everything, because the spirit had seen Jesus, knows who he is, and throws this young man into a fit. Think about this. Jesus asked about the boy's condition, coming down here into verse 21 when he says, "How long has this been happening to him?" And what do we see? Jesus asked about it because the boy's condition, not because he needed to know, but because the Father needed to understand his hopelessness without Christ. Which brings us down to the 20. So we see here Jesus, how long has this been happening to him? And we think, and the father says from childhood. We don't know how old this young man is. He's young. Apparently his father. We know his father's still living. We're not sure how old he is, but we know he's a young man. He's not what would be considered to be old. But we look at this and we're reminded. We see this here, and we're listening to the words of this young man's father. In verse 22, he says, "From childhood." When he says in verse 21, he says, "From childhood." Verse 22 continues on. He says, "And often he has thrown him. This demon has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." We hear that we hear the words of a father, and if you have children, you'll understand the pleading that this father would have been making to Jesus at this point. We realize that he's pleading. He's there's a desperation in this dad's voice, talking about his son. When he says, "But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." We think about think about this scenario. Some fail to see the problem with this statement. Well, what was the issue with what he said? He said to Jesus, "If you can do anything." See, that he knows that he is a. He knows that Jesus is the Christ. Apparently, he realized that he is of great stature, but he doesn't fully realize the magnitude of who he's talking to, or who he's in front, or whose presence he's in. Or could be that the man obviously doubted the power of Jesus, likely due to the failure of Jesus' disciples. The man knew who Jesus was. I mean, we could ask a lot of questions like I just previously posed. Think about this. If we were in that young man's dad's shoes, bringing a child to the apostles and saying, "My child is overtaken, is possessed by a demon. They're unable to cast him out." Well, if they're his apostles and they can't do it, I'm really not sure that their master's going to be able to do it. But notice what Jesus says in verse 23. He says, "If you can, all things are possible to him who believes." Let me start over on that. Jesus says to the young man's dad, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." If you can. You can hear the Lord's rebuke of the Father's faith, of when he says, "If you can do anything." Well, Jesus is saying, "I can do anything." He says, but Jesus said, all things are possible with what? If we believe. But then we move into verse 24. First off, the Father said he believed. But then but stop and think about this. He said something more powerful than that. He says, "Lord, I believe." Then he continues on. He says, "Help my unbelief." Wow. What a powerful statement. Have we ever stopped and asked God to help our faith? To help us to build our faith stronger? Maybe something we're struggling with. Lord, help me with my unbelief. That takes a lot of courage to say that, especially standing in front of Jesus Christ as this man was. Then we come down here in a faith-inspiring demonstration that Jesus gives, verses 25 through 27. Jesus casts this demon out. But the demon didn't leave quietly, did it? The defeated demon did come out, but left the boy looking like a corpse. It looked dead. Of course he would. He just used every last bit of physical energy that this young man's body had in it. But what happens? Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up. But let's back up here for just a moment. Jesus rebukes this unclean spirit, this demon, and says to it, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more." Wow. Jesus helps this young man up. Of course, special comfort is given to the Father, and when Jesus commanded the demon to not enter into him again. Faith-inspiring demonstration. Jesus did that. He laid that before those who were there because he wanted to get on with having time with his apostles and his disciples he had there. He wanted to spend more time with them. He wanted to spend more time with them, which he's going to. Now we move on down in the chapter, verse 28, and we see the power of faith. Jesus' disciples asked Jesus why they were not able to cast out the demon in verse 28. It says, when Jesus had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" Well, apparently they had been casting out demons, so that was not the problem. We see that from back in Mark chapter 6, verse 13. Pay attention, though. Jesus told them their issue. Jesus tells them their issue. Go back to Matthew chapter 17, verses 19 through 21. We turn back to Matthew 17, 19 through 21. We read Matthew recording of this, his record of this. He said this account. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why could we not cast it out?" So Jesus said to them, "Because of your unbelief. For surely I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting." Notice what Jesus starts off with it here. Starts off the lack of their faith. Starts with a lack of faith. It is because of the littleness of your faith. You have no faith. You have unbelief here. Would it surprise us? Does it surprise you that the apostles' faith would be little? That is small. We have to think about this. They had some faith. They had some faith because they assumed they could cast the demon out, but their faith still lacked. Well, we begin to think about these things, and we look at it, and Jesus goes on, and he provokes them when he says, "Because of your unbelief, for surely I say to you," and then he goes on. He says, "If you have the faith as a mustard seed." Wow. Think about a mustard seed is really small, but it's still real. Think about if you've ever seen a mustard seed. It's very small, very tiny, but it's alive. You can plant it in a mustard produce a mustard plant. So it is alive. It's real. It's alive. It has great potential behind it. But think about this. Though a mustard seed is small and weak, doesn't mean that it's not worth anything. It willingly accepts the strength of the soil that surrounds it to give it the nurture, to nurture it and give it the strength to be able to grow. Size of faith is not as important as the focus of our faith. That's what we must realize. The result of our faith is that nothing will be impossible as in moving mountains. Did Jesus literally mean we can move dirt and rocks? Well, metaphorically speaking, is what he's been speaking of, and mountains would have been the largest object around for him to prove a point with. We often use the phrase, "I'm buried under a mountain of paperwork," or making a mountain out of a molehill. There's what Jesus is getting at. Mountains here are representing obstacles. What he's saying is there's nothing you cannot overcome with the right type of faith existing in your life. Why did they have a lack of prayer? Well, could have been because of a lack of their the apostles' prayer life. We do not need to forget the response in Mark chapter 9 verse 29 either. Mark 9:29 he says, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." Disciples' prayer life was not in order. Jesus was not simply saying that they did not pray and therefore the demon did not come out of this young man. Jesus did not pray before casting this demon out. It appears that the disciples started looking at their own ability more than depending on God's. What is Jesus getting at? Think about this. If you do not have a strong prayer life, you're going to say to God, "I don't need you. I can do it myself." That we can be praying to God, but are we praying for everything in life? Or do we have those things that we look at and say, "I can do it myself. I can do it myself. I don't need to pray about that." We're told to pray without ceasing. Not meaning we need to be praying 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We need to remember who is the author, the creator, the giver and sustainer of life, both physical and spiritual. Jehovah God. We need to lean on him in every aspect of life. So as we come down to this and we come to the end of this lesson, what can we learn about our faith? Now, one of those things is there are times we can come down off of a spiritual mountain only for our faith to be challenged. And also learn that there are times we need Christ to help us with our unbelief. We need to take Jesus at his word when he says faith the size of a mustard seed can do great things. Our faith must be real, must be alive, and willing to be nourished by something far greater than we are, the Lord and his word. Our faith cannot stay alive without God and our dependence on him. Let's end this lesson with this. Tell us about your faith right now. Is it where it needs to be? If not, do something about it. Pray that these lessons are beneficial to you. Pray that you'll continue to go through this study with us as we continue to study the life of Christ. Until next time, I'm Jonathan Bennett. God bless you.